May 15, 1945. The morning fog hung thick over a captured German airfield in southern Bavaria, where American forces had established a temporary supply depot just 72 hours earlier. Private First Class Marcus Johnson, an 18-year-old aerial gunner from Detroit, Michigan, sat on the tail section of a damaged transport aircraft, exhausted from 3 consecutive nights of guard duty, watching the sun slowly burn through the mist. The air smelled of damp earth, aviation fuel, and the lingering smoke from distant fires still burning in the surrounding countryside. He had no idea that in less than 6 hours, a simple moment of carelessness would transform him from an anonymous serviceman into a legend whispered about in military circles for decades to come. The young gunner believed this quiet morning marked the end of the conflict in Europe, a time to finally rest after months of relentless operations. He could not have been more mistaken. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Marcus Johnson was about to trigger would not only expose a critical intelligence failure, but would also reveal one of the most elaborate deception operations ever conceived by retreating forces, changing how military strategists would forever approach seemingly abandoned enemy installations. The journey that brought Marcus to this moment had been long and arduous. Born in January 1927 in the Brewster Douglas housing projects, the largest public housing development in Detroit, Marcus had grown up during the depths of the economic depression. His father, William Johnson, worked at the Ford River Rouge complex when work was available, assembling automobiles on production lines that moved with mechanical precision. His mother, Eleanor Johnson, taught at a segregated elementary school where she inspired hundreds of children despite inadequate resources and systemic discrimination. Marcus had been 12 years old when the conflict in Europe began in 1939. He remembered listening to radio broadcasts with his family, his father's face grim as announcements detailed the rapid conquest of Poland and the subsequent declarations that plunged the continent into total conflict. For Marcus and his friends, growing up in Detroit during those years meant watching the automobile factories transform into arsenals of production, churning out vehicles, aircraft engines, and munitions at unprecedented rates. By the time Marcus turned 17 in January 1944, the conflict had touched every aspect of American life. Young men from his neighborhood were departing for training camps throughout the country. Rationing affected every household. The newspapers published casualty lists that grew longer with each passing week. Marcus himself had received his draft notice in March 1944, just 2 months after his birthday. His mother had cried when the envelope arrived, though she tried to hide her tears. His father had gripped his shoulder firmly and said simply, "Do your duty, son, come home safe." His younger sister, Teresa, then 15 years old, had hugged him fiercely and made him promise to write letters every week. Basic training at Camp Shelby in Mississippi had been Marcus's first extended time outside Michigan. The experience exposed him to both the camaraderie of shared hardship and the harsh reality of segregation in the military. African-American servicemen trained in separate units, ate in separate facilities, and were generally assigned to support roles rather than combat positions. But Marcus's exceptional performance on marksmanship tests and his remarkably steady hands under pressure had led to his assignment as an aerial gunner, a position that, while still segregated, at least offered the opportunity to directly engage in combat operations. The flight to the target took over 3 hours, the bomber formation climbing to high altitude where the temperature dropped far below freezing. Marcus, sealed in his tail turret wearing an electrically heated flight suit that only partially compensated for the brutal cold, scanned the sky behind them continuously. The formation consisted of 36 bombers, arranged in tight groups for mutual defensive fire. Above and around them flew escort fighters, whose presence offered some psychological comfort, though Marcus knew they could not protect against every threat. The German response came as the formation approached the target. Marcus saw them first, small dots against the clouds that resolved into hostile fighters, diving toward the formation. His voice crackled over the intercom. "Bandits!" 6 o'clock high, diving in. What followed was a chaotic blur of action that lasted perhaps 3 minutes but felt like hours. The fighters made multiple passes, their weapons firing in bursts that sometimes found their targets. Marcus tracked targets with his guns, firing controlled bursts when the hostile aircraft entered his effective range. The smell of spent ammunition filled the turret. The sound of his own weapons firing mingled with the roar of engines and the impact of incoming fire striking other bombers in the formation. One German fighter pressed its attack despite taking hits from multiple defensive positions. Marcus watched it grow larger in his sights, fired a sustained burst, and saw pieces separate from the aircraft. The fighter rolled away, trailing smoke, and disappeared into the clouds below. Whether it was destroyed or merely damaged, Marcus never knew. There was no time for confirmation or celebration. More fighters were attacking. The formation reached the target and released its payload. Marcus felt the bomber lift slightly as the weight dropped away. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom, steady despite the ongoing combat. Bombs away, heading home. The return flight brought additional challenges. Sweet Georgia Brown had taken several hits. The hydraulic system was partially damaged, which would complicate landing. One engine was running rough, consuming oil faster than normal. But they remained airborne and they had defended themselves successfully. Marcus learned later that 3 bombers from the formation had been shot down during the mission. 121 men had departed that morning. 92 returned. This was Marcus's introduction to aerial combat. Over the following months, he flew 16 more missions. Each one brought similar experiences. The hours of tedious flight punctuated by minutes of intense terror and action. He watched friends die. He saw bombers explode, break apart, fall burning from the sky. He witnessed extraordinary acts of courage and equally extraordinary luck. He learned to function despite fear, to perform his duties methodically even when every instinct screamed to flee or freeze. By the time the formal surrender occurred in May 1945, Marcus had accumulated more combat experience than many servicemen who had been in Europe since 1943. His 17 missions represented 17 times he had flown into hostile territory. 17 times he had faced the possibility of not returning. 17 times he had performed his duties and survived. These experiences had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with the passage of time. Marcus had arrived at this airfield as part of the 332nd Fighter Group, a unit that had distinguished itself throughout the final months of the conflict in Europe. But before reaching this point, he had experienced a journey that transformed him from a nervous teenager into a combat-tested veteran. His deployment to Europe came in September 1944, when his bomber unit crossed the Atlantic aboard a crowded transport ship. The crossing took 11 days, during which hundreds of young men lived in cramped quarters below deck, many experiencing seasickness for the first time, all contemplating what awaited them on the other side. Marcus spent those days writing letters home, playing cards with his crewmates, and trying to imagine what combat would actually feel like. They arrived at a staging base in England, where the reality of aerial conflict became immediately apparent. The base had lost 3 bombers the previous week. Fresh crews were needed immediately to maintain operational strength. Marcus and his fellow gunners were assigned to existing bomber crews, filling positions left vacant by casualties. The bomber he joined, a heavy aircraft designated Sweet Georgia Brown by its crew, had already completed 9 missions. The previous tail gunner had been wounded during a mission over occupied France and evacuated for medical treatment. Marcus met his new crew on a cold October morning. The pilot, Captain Robert Mitchell from Oregon, was 24 years old, but looked a decade older, his face lined with fatigue and stress. The co-pilot, Lieutenant James Harrison from Virginia, had a nervous habit of checking and rechecking instruments, even when the aircraft was parked. The navigator, Lieutenant David Goldman from New York, spoke with rapid precision, a mathematics prodigy who had calculated bombing trajectories for 7 successful missions. The bombardier, Lieutenant Charles Washington from Alabama, was another African-American serviceman, one of the relatively few who had been trained for this technical position. The radio operator, Sergeant Robert Lee from Texas, could transcribe Morse code faster than most men could write longhand. The flight engineer, Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Massachusetts, knew every system on the bomber with intimate familiarity. The waist gunners, Corporals Thomas Wright and Henry Davis, were both from Chicago and had trained together since basic instruction. Marcus took his position as tail gunner, the most isolated and perhaps most vulnerable position on the aircraft. The tail turret was cramped, cold, and offered limited visibility, except directly to the rear. During missions, Marcus would spend hours in this tiny space, thousands of meters above the Earth, responsible for defending the bomber's most vulnerable approach angle. His first combat mission came 3 days after joining the crew. The target was a rail yard in western Germany, part of the ongoing campaign to disrupt transportation and logistics. Marcus remembered every detail of that mission with crystal clarity, even years later, the pre-dawn briefing where the target was revealed, the heavy breakfast that many men could barely eat, the preparation of equipment and weapons, the walk to the aircraft in the dark, breath visible in the cold air, the roar of engines starting, the taxi to the runway, the feeling of acceleration as the heavily loaded bomber built speed for takeoff, the moment when the wheels left the ground and they were committed to the mission. The airfield itself sprawled across nearly 2 square kilometers of flat Bavarian countryside. Intelligence reports indicated it had been a training facility for the German Air Force, abandoned 3 weeks prior as Allied forces advanced. When American units arrived on May 12th, they found the facility seemingly deserted. Rows of damaged aircraft lined the tarmac, their engines cannibalized for parts. Hangars stood empty, except for scattered tools and discarded equipment. The control tower windows were shattered, and administration buildings showed signs of hasty evacuation. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, the commanding officer overseeing the depot establishment, had ordered standard reconnaissance sweeps. His report to divisional headquarters noted no signs of booby traps or defensive positions. The airfield appeared to be exactly what it seemed, another casualty of the German collapse, valuable only for its intact runways and storage facilities. But Hayes had not ordered excavation of the supposedly sealed underground fuel storage system. He had not sent engineers to probe beneath the seemingly solid concrete foundations of the destroyed maintenance hangars. And he certainly had not anticipated that the retreating forces might leave behind something far more valuable than booby traps. Marcus Johnson knew none of this as he sat smoking that morning. He had drawn the short straw for perimeter patrol, a tedious assignment made more frustrating by the unofficial end of hostilities. The formal surrender had occurred a week earlier, and most servicemen at the depot felt they were simply waiting for orders to ship home. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost festive. Men played cards in the shade of aircraft wings. Someone had rigged a radio to play music from Armed Forces Network. The smell of coffee and breakfast rations drifted across the tarmac. Corporal James Williams approached Marcus around 0800 hours, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. Williams, a 22-year-old from Atlanta, Georgia, had served as a radio operator on Marcus's bomber crew. The two had developed a close friendship, forged through shared danger, and the particular bond that formed among African-American servicemen serving in a still segregated military. Williams himself had an interesting background that he shared with Marcus during the long hours of flight and the equally long hours of waiting between missions. His father had been a Pullman porter, one of the few relatively stable positions available to African-American men during the Depression years. His mother worked as a domestic servant for a wealthy white family in Atlanta. Williams had completed 2 years of college, studying electrical engineering before the draft interrupted his education. His technical knowledge and steady demeanor under pressure made him an excellent radio operator. During their months flying together, Williams and Marcus had developed the kind of trust that only forms when lives depend on mutual competence. Marcus had defended the bomber, while Williams maintained vital communications with base and other aircraft. They had celebrated successful missions together and mourned lost friends together. They had discussed their hopes for the future, their frustrations with military segregation, and their determination to survive and return home. Now, in May 1945, they found themselves not flying combat missions, but performing mundane garrison duties at a captured airfield. The transition from the intensity of combat to the tedium of occupation had been jarring for both of them. After months of living with constant danger, the sudden absence of immediate threat felt almost unsettling. They struggled to adjust to days that passed without life-threatening emergencies. without the need to perform at maximum capacity just to survive. Williams handed Marcus a cup and sat down beside him on the aircraft tail section. The coffee was terrible, as always, made from grounds that had been used at least twice before and heated over a field stove. But it was hot, and it was familiar, and these small comforts mattered more than anyone who had not experienced military life could understand. "So this is victory," Williams said with a tired smile. "Sitting on broken German planes, drinking terrible coffee, in a country that doesn't want us here, while waiting for somebody back home to decide what to do with us." Marcus laughed and took a sip, wincing at the bitter taste. "Could be worse," he replied. "Could still be getting shot at. Could be explaining to Captain Mitchell why we let another fighter get through our defensive fire. Could be writing letters to the families of crew members who didn't make it back." Williams nodded, his expression turning more serious. "I keep thinking about Morrison," he said quietly, referring to their former waist gunner who had been wounded during their 15th mission. "Last I heard, he was still in a hospital in England, lost most of his left hand. He was a piano player before the service. Did you know that?" Marcus had not known. It struck him how little they really knew about each other, despite flying together for months. Combat missions did not leave much room for personal conversations. You survived, or you did not. You performed your duties, or you failed. The details of previous lives seemed almost irrelevant in the face of immediate necessity. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the camp come to life around them. The supply depot had been established quickly and functioned with the efficient chaos typical of military logistics operations. Supply trucks rumbled across the tarmac, their engines adding to the ambient noise. A work detail began offloading crates from a transport vehicle, the men moving with the slow reluctance of those assigned tedious labor. In the distance, a sergeant barked orders at a group of reluctant privates tasked with latrine duty, his voice carrying across the airfield with impressive volume. The airfield itself showed clear signs of hasty abandonment by its previous occupants. Damaged aircraft, stripped of usable parts, sat in irregular rows along the taxiways. Several hangar buildings had sustained damage, whether from aerial attacks or deliberate sabotage was unclear. The control tower windows were shattered, and birds had already begun nesting in the exposed interior. Administration buildings stood with doors hanging open, their contents scattered by either retreating personnel or exploring American servicemen. Williams pulled out a pack of cigarettes, Lucky Strikes that had arrived in the latest supply drop. The sight of fresh American cigarettes was always welcome after weeks of making do with whatever could be scrounged or traded. He offered one to Marcus, who accepted gratefully. Marcus had not been a smoker before the military. His mother would have disapproved strongly. But combat had introduced him to the habit, as it had for countless other young men. The ritual of smoking provided small moments of normalcy, brief interludes of familiar action in a world that had become strange and dangerous. The act of lighting a cigarette, inhaling, exhaling, watching the smoke drift away, these simple actions connected them to peacetime life, to the world they had known before uniforms and combat. They lit up using Williams's battered Zippo lighter, a gift from his father that had survived all 17 combat missions without being lost or damaged. The flame flickered bright in the morning gloom, and Marcus watched Williams cup his hands around it with practiced ease. The first drag was always the best, that initial hit of nicotine after hours without. Marcus smoked absently, his mind wandering to thoughts of home. His mother's letters, which arrived irregularly through military post, spoke of the preparations being made for his return. She described how the neighborhood was changing, how some families were already celebrating the return of their sons, how his old school had held an assembly honoring former students who had served. His younger sister, Teresa, had graduated from high school with top honors and been accepted to a teacher training college. His father's factory had shifted back to civilian automobile production, though William Johnson himself had taken a supervisory position that reflected both his experience and the gradual changes in opportunities for African-American workers. Eleanor Johnson wrote with careful detail about domestic matters. She described the victory garden she maintained in the small plot behind their apartment building, how the tomatoes this year were particularly good, how she had canned preserves to celebrate Marcus's return. She mentioned neighbors and friends who had served and who had not yet returned, maintaining connections to a community Marcus had not seen in over a year. She never wrote about her fears or worries, but Marcus could read between the lines of her carefully optimistic prose. Teresa's letters were more direct and emotional. She wrote about missing her big brother, about being proud of his service but also terrified every time she heard news reports about casualties. She described her plans for college, her hopes to become a teacher like their mother, her determination to make something of the opportunities that were slowly opening for African American women. She asked questions about Europe, about what he had seen, about whether the places were really as old and different as movies suggested. Marcus tried to answer these questions honestly, while omitting the darker realities of his experience. He finished the cigarette and, without thinking, flicked the still glowing butt away. It was a thoughtless gesture, the kind of small action performed thousands of times a day by servicemen across Europe. The cigarette butt arced through the air in a lazy parabola, its glowing end leaving a brief trail against the foggy morning, and landed near the base of what appeared to be a solid concrete drainage grate, partially obscured by gravel and weeds about 15 meters from where they sat. What happened next unfolded with a speed that would later be described in official reports as absolutely unprecedented. The cigarette butt rolled slightly on the uneven ground, propelled by its own momentum, and came to rest against the edge of the grate. For perhaps 3 seconds, nothing occurred. The cigarette simply lay there, its ember slowly consuming the remaining paper and tobacco. Then a thin wisp of smoke, darker and thicker than tobacco smoke, began rising from the grate. Marcus noticed it first and stood up, his combat-trained instincts immediately recognizing that something was wrong. "That does not look right," he said to Williams, pointing toward the grate. Before Williams could respond, a muffled sound echoed from beneath the ground, like distant thunder or a bass drum struck underwater. The sound was felt as much as heard, a low-frequency vibration that traveled through the ground and into their bodies. The concrete around the grate cracked with a sharp report, lines radiating outward from the center like a spider web. More smoke began pouring out, thick and black and carrying the unmistakable odor of petroleum products burning, a smell both men recognized immediately from their experience with aircraft fuel and engines. Marcus's combat instincts, honed through 17 missions where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death, overrode his confusion. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing Williams by the arm and pulling him to his feet. "Something is burning down there. Move now." They sprinted away from the aircraft toward the main camp area, their boots pounding against the concrete tarmac. Behind them, smoke continued to billow from the grate with increasing intensity, the column growing thicker and darker with each passing second. The smell of burning petroleum grew stronger, carried on the morning breeze across the airfield. Other servicemen had noticed now. Voices called out in alarm, some asking questions, others shouting warnings. Someone near the command post rang the emergency bell, a harsh clanging that cut through the morning routine and brought men running from various duties. Within seconds, the entire camp was mobilizing. Soldiers emerging from tents and buildings, officers demanding reports, confusion spreading as no one initially understood what was happening. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes emerged from his temporary headquarters, still buckling his belt, his face showing the irritation of being interrupted during his morning routine. "What in God's name?" he began, but the words died as he saw the smoke column rising from the supposedly solid ground of the airfield. His expression shifted from irritation to concern to something approaching alarm as he processed what he was seeing. "Get fire equipment," Hayes shouted to his aide, a young lieutenant who stood frozen in surprise, "and clear everyone back from that area. Do it now, Lieutenant. Sound general alarm." The response was immediate but inadequate. The base's firefighting capability consisted of 2 aging German pumper trucks that had been left behind when the airfield was abandoned, neither in particularly good condition, plus some portable extinguishers and sand buckets scattered around the camp. Against whatever was burning beneath the ground, these resources were barely better than nothing. But the fire equipment, 2 aging German pumper trucks that had been left behind and barely functional, proved immediately inadequate. As the first truck approached the smoking grate, the ground around it suddenly collapsed inward, revealing a concrete stairway descending into darkness. Flames roared up from below with such ferocity that the truck driver slammed on his brakes and reversed rapidly. What emerged from that underground space over the next several minutes defied every expectation. The fire spread with impossible speed, following invisible channels beneath the supposedly solid airfield surface. More grates and concealed ventilation shafts began venting smoke. The ground trembled. And then, with a sound like ripping fabric amplified 1,000 times, a section of the eastern taxiway measuring roughly 30 meters by 50 meters simply dropped 3 meters, exposing an enormous underground cavern. From Marcus's vantage point, now a safe 200 meters away with the rest of the evacuated personnel, the sight was incomprehensible. The cavern was not natural. It was clearly constructed, with concrete walls and ceiling supports, filled with row upon row of aircraft. Not damaged aircraft, not cannibalized wrecks, but intact, fully assembled fighter planes, their wings folded or removed for storage, their cockpits covered with protective tarps, their landing gear carefully braced. Hayes stood beside Marcus, his face pale. His hands shook as he raised binoculars to examine the revealed cache. "Sweet, merciful heaven," he whispered. "There must be 200 planes down there." A major from the intelligence corps, previously bored with garrison duty, suddenly became the most active person on the airfield. Major Paul Richardson had served in North Africa and Italy, analyzing captured enemy installations. He began issuing rapid orders. "Get engineers here immediately," he commanded. "I want structural assessments of every square meter of this airfield and radio divisional headquarters. Tell them we have a situation that requires immediate expert evaluation." As engineers arrived and began careful probing operations, the true scope of the discovery became apparent. The airfield was not an airfield at all, or rather, it was simultaneously an airfield and an elaborate illusion. The retreating German forces had not abandoned it. They had concealed it. Beneath the seemingly damaged surface installations lay a massive underground complex. The excavation had been achieved by exploiting natural limestone caverns and expanding them with forced labor over a period estimated at 18 months. The visible airfield above was essentially a roof, a carefully constructed deception. The underground facility included not just aircraft storage, but also machine shops, assembly areas, fuel storage systems holding over 6 million liters of aviation fuel, ammunition magazines, spare parts warehouses, and even living quarters for maintenance crews. The fuel storage system, which Marcus's cigarette had ignited, consisted of a network of interconnected tanks and pipes running throughout the complex. By midday, as fire crews struggled to contain the spreading underground blaze, the count of concealed aircraft had reached 237. They represented multiple models, including some that intelligence analysts had believed existed only in prototype stages. There were jet-powered fighters that would have represented a significant technological advantage. There were long-range reconnaissance variants carrying camera equipment more advanced than anything in American inventory. There were night fighter models equipped with radar systems. Captain David Chen, an engineering officer from San Francisco, supervised the structural investigation. His team used portable drilling equipment to sample the ground throughout the airfield. They discovered that approximately 60% of the facility's surface was actually reinforced concrete laid over hollow spaces, disguised with careful application of soil, gravel, and vegetation. The concealment had been extraordinarily sophisticated. Ventilation for the underground spaces was disguised as natural terrain features. Drainage grates, like the one that had proved Marcus's accidental ignition point, were actually cleverly hidden access ports for the fuel distribution system. The damaged aircraft visible on the surface had been deliberately positioned to suggest abandonment and to discourage thorough investigation. Chen explained the deception to Hayes and Richardson as they stood watching smoke pour from multiple ground breaches. "They wanted us to see an abandoned airfield," Chen said, his voice filled with reluctant admiration. "They knew we would need the runways for our own logistics. They knew we would not waste time and resources thoroughly investigating what appeared obvious. This was designed to be overlooked until they could return." Richardson nodded grimly. "Or until they could activate whatever personnel they left behind to sabotage our operations," he added. "If we had started storing our own fuel and ammunition here without discovering this, they could have destroyed our entire supply line with one coordinated action." The implications sent a chill through every officer present. The conflict in Europe might have officially ended, but clearly not everyone had accepted that conclusion. This installation represented planning that extended beyond immediate military necessity into longer-term strategic positioning. Marcus Johnson, the inadvertent discoverer of this elaborate secret, found himself the subject of intense attention. Intelligence officers questioned him repeatedly about exactly what he had observed. His testimony, given multiple times over the following days, was remarkably consistent. He had discarded a cigarette. It had fallen into a crack near a grate. Smoke had appeared. He had reacted instinctively. But the military, uncomfortable with the idea that sheer accident had prevented what might have been a catastrophic security failure, began constructing alternative narratives. Some reports suggested Marcus had noticed suspicious vapor or unusual ground temperature. Others implied he had deliberately investigated an anomaly. By the time news of the discovery reached American newspapers in early June, the story had transformed Marcus into a hero whose vigilance and quick thinking had uncovered enemy perfidy. Williams, who had been there for the actual event, found the growing mythology amusing. "You know they are going to give you a medal for throwing away a cigarette," he told Marcus one evening, as they sat in their assigned quarters. Marcus shook his head. "I just wanted to smoke in peace," he replied. "I had no idea anything was wrong until the ground started smoking back at me. The fire in the underground fuel system burned for 11 days, despite the best efforts of specialized firefighting units brought in from as far away as France. The network of fuel pipes and storage tanks had been designed with multiple redundancies, which meant the fire could spread through pathways that were difficult to access or predict. Each time crews thought they had contained the blaze, it would erupt in a new location. The smoke, visible for kilometers, attracted attention from passing aircraft and distant observation posts. By May 20th, the airfield had become the focus of intensive investigation by multiple intelligence agencies. Teams arrived from Britain, France, and even Soviet liaison officers appeared, all eager to examine this revelation of how thoroughly the enemy had prepared for scenarios beyond immediate military defeat. Technical experts spent weeks cataloging the underground complex. The aircraft alone represented extraordinary value, not as weapons but as intelligence sources. Engineers examined propulsion systems, metallurgy, and manufacturing techniques. Captured documentation found in fireproof safes within the underground offices revealed production schedules, testing data, and deployment plans that extended into 1946 and beyond. One document in particular captured attention across Allied intelligence services. It was a detailed plan for the establishment of similar concealed facilities at 17 other locations throughout southern Germany and Austria. The plan assumed that formal military defeat would not end resistance, but would instead transition into a prolonged period of hidden preparation for renewed conflict. Major Richardson compiled a comprehensive report on the facility for his superiors. His conclusions were sobering. The construction of this complex required the coordination of thousands of workers, substantial material resources, and sophisticated planning, he wrote. That such an effort could be completed without our intelligence networks detecting it suggests significant blind spots in our understanding of enemy capabilities and intentions. The accidental discovery by Private First Class Johnson prevented what could have been a catastrophic failure of post-conflict security operations. For Marcus, the experience was both surreal and troubling. He had survived 17 combat missions through skill, training, and considerable luck. But his place in military history would be secured not by any of those harrowing flights through hostile fire, but by a carelessly discarded cigarette on a quiet morning when everyone thought the fighting had ended. His unit remained at the airfield through June, assisting with the investigation and security operations. The underground complex, once the fires were finally extinguished, became a valuable intelligence and training resource. American servicemen toured the facility in organized groups, studying the construction techniques and concealment methods. The captured aircraft were meticulously documented, then carefully transported to testing facilities in England and the United States. On June 23, 1945, a formal ceremony was held at the airfield, now officially designated Forward Operating Base Richardson, in honor of the major whose analytical work had revealed the full scope of the discovery. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, recently promoted to full colonel for his management of the situation, presided over the ceremony. Marcus Johnson was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for meritorious service. The citation praised his alertness and immediate action in response to signs of danger, language that diplomatically avoided mentioning the cigarette. Williams received a commendation for his assistance in the evacuation. Several other servicemen received recognition for their roles in containing the situation. Hayes pinned the medal on Marcus's uniform and shook his hand firmly. "The Army is proud of your service, Private First Class Johnson," Hayes said formally. "Your actions exemplify the vigilance required even in moments when danger seems absent." Marcus accepted the honor with appropriate humility, but later that evening, he confessed his mixed feelings to Williams. "I appreciate the recognition," he said, "but I cannot shake the feeling that we are being honored for something that was pure accident. I was not vigilant. I was not alert to danger. I was tired and careless." Williams considered this thoughtfully. "Maybe that is the real lesson here," he finally replied. "Maybe the point is not that you were some kind of perfect soldier who detected a hidden threat. Maybe the point is that even ordinary moments, even small actions, can have enormous consequences. You did not intend to discover anything. But you did. And because you did, a lot of people are safer now." The captured facility continued to yield intelligence throughout the summer of 1945. Interrogations of local civilians revealed that construction had indeed employed forced labor, primarily prisoners from nearby camps who had been worked under brutal conditions. Many had not survived the project. This darker aspect of the discovery added weight to the understanding that what had been found was not merely a military installation, but another piece of the regime's apparatus of oppression. Technical analysis of the captured aircraft proved particularly valuable. Several models incorporated design innovations that influenced American and British aerospace development in subsequent years. The jet propulsion systems, though less advanced than some Allied designs, showed interesting alternative approaches to specific engineering challenges. The radar equipment found in night fighter variants provided insights into electronic warfare techniques. One captured aircraft, a reconnaissance variant equipped with high-altitude photography equipment, became particularly important to intelligence analysts. Its camera systems were more sophisticated than expected, and examination of the aircraft's maintenance logs suggested it had been operational as recently as early May, conducting flights over Allied-controlled territory even after the formal surrender. This evidence supported the theory that the facility had maintained a covert operational capacity even while appearing abandoned. By August, when Marcus Johnson finally received orders to return to the United States for demobilization, the airfield had been thoroughly investigated and repurposed as a regular Allied logistics hub. The underground portions had been sealed after all useful materials and intelligence were extracted. The entrance that Marcus's cigarette had accidentally revealed was filled with rubble and capped with fresh concrete. On his final day at the facility, Marcus took a walk around the perimeter, retracing the path of that morning in May. The spot where he had sat on the aircraft tail section was now occupied by a supply depot. The grate where his cigarette had fallen was buried beneath tons of rubble. Nothing remained visible to mark the location of his accidental discovery. He thought about the strange path that had brought him from Detroit to this Bavarian airfield, from factory worker's son to decorated serviceman. He thought about the 17 combat missions that had tested his courage and skill, and how none of them had resulted in the recognition he had received for an act of pure chance. He thought about the German workers who had died constructing the underground facility, victims of a regime's desperate planning. He thought about what might have happened if his cigarette had landed half a meter in a different direction. Williams found him there, standing quietly in the August sunshine. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Marcus nodded slowly. "More than ready," he replied. "But I think I will remember this place for the rest of my life, not because of the medal or the recognition, but because it taught me something important." "What is that?" Williams asked. "That the consequences of our actions, even the smallest ones, ripple outward in ways we cannot predict or control," Marcus said. "I thought I was just having a cigarette. Turns out I was exposing a secret that could have cost lives if it had remained hidden. It makes you wonder how many other small moments in our lives might matter more than we realize. They walked back to the transport area together, two young men heading home after experiencing the reality of conflict, carrying with them lessons learned through experience rather than instruction. Marcus Johnson returned to Detroit in September 1945. He attended college on the new educational benefits available to returning servicemen, eventually earning a degree in mechanical engineering. He worked for 3 decades in the automobile industry, contributing to manufacturing innovations that helped Detroit maintain its position as a center of American production. He married, raised 4 children, and became active in veterans organizations and civil rights advocacy. He rarely spoke publicly about his military service. When asked about the Bronze Star Medal, which he kept in a simple frame in his study, he would tell the factual story without embellishment. "I discarded a cigarette carelessly," he would say. "It happened to fall in exactly the wrong place, or the right place, depending on how you look at it. The military chose to call it vigilance, I call it dumb luck, but to close friends and family, he would sometimes reflect more deeply on the experience. That moment taught me to pay attention to consequences," he once told his oldest daughter. "Every action matters, every choice ripples outward." We like to think we can separate the important moments from the trivial ones, but life does not work that way. Sometimes the most significant things happen when we are not trying to be significant at all. The captured Airfield facility became a footnote in military histories of the period. Declassified documents released decades later revealed that the installation Marcus accidentally exposed was one of 3 similar facilities actually completed, out of the 17 planned. The other 2 were discovered through conventional intelligence work in July and August of 1945. None achieved the scale or sophistication of the Bavarian site. Intelligence analysts concluded that the concealment program represented a significant allocation of resources during a period when the regime was supposedly focused on immediate military needs. The decision to build such facilities, even as the strategic situation deteriorated catastrophically, suggested a level of denial about the reality of their situation that bordered on delusional. They continued planning for scenarios that required months or years to unfold, even as their remaining controlled territory shrank to a fraction of its former extent. The facility also became a case study in military deception and counterintelligence. Training programs incorporated lessons learned from examining the concealment techniques. Engineers studied the construction methods to better understand how to detect similar installations. Intelligence officers analyzed the documentation to comprehend the planning processes that had made such an elaborate deception possible. One particularly interesting aspect emerged from psychological evaluations of captured personnel who had been involved in planning the concealed facility program. These individuals uniformly believed, even after the formal surrender, that the conflict was merely entering a new phase rather than truly ending. They had internalized propaganda about secret weapons and ultimate victory so thoroughly that objective reality could not penetrate their convictions. The facilities were designed not for immediate military necessity, but to serve these fantasy scenarios of resurgence. This psychological dimension fascinated post-conflict analysts. How could educated, technically skilled individuals so completely disconnect from observable reality? The answer seemed to lie in a combination of propaganda, ideological commitment, and the human tendency to continue existing patterns of behavior even when circumstances have fundamentally changed. The engineers and officers who designed the concealment program were executing familiar tasks, applying their professional expertise, following established procedures. The fact that these activities no longer served any realistic purpose became irrelevant within the closed system of their beliefs. Marcus Johnson, reading about these analyses in later years, found them troubling in a different way than his original discovery had been. The facility itself was frightening because of what might have happened, but the psychology behind it was frightening because it revealed how easily intelligent people could be trapped in patterns of thought that defied basic logic. He discussed this once with Williams, who had remained a close friend. They were attending a veterans reunion in 1968, 23 years after that morning in Bavaria. The two men, now in their early 40s, sat in a hotel bar late at night, nursing drinks and reminiscing. "What strikes me now," Marcus said, "is not that we found all those hidden aircraft. It is that people built that entire installation while their country was collapsing around them. They had to have known at some level that it was pointless, but they kept doing it anyway." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Fear," he suggested, "fear of stopping, fear of admitting they had been wrong about everything, fear of facing consequences, so they kept building and planning and pretending that somehow things would work out." Marcus swirled his drink, watching the ice shift. "Makes me think about all the ways we avoid facing reality," he said. "Not just them, all of us. How many things do we keep doing simply because we have always done them, even when they no longer make sense?" It was a question that stayed with him throughout his life. The accidental discovery that morning in May 1945 became, for Marcus, a lens through which to view human behavior more broadly. "We are all capable of building underground facilities in our lives," he once wrote in a letter to his son. "We all have things we hide, even from ourselves. We all continue patterns that no longer serve us. The question is whether we have the courage to let them be exposed, whether by accident or intention, and then to honestly assess what we find." The physical site of the airfield underwent various transformations in subsequent decades. Initially maintained as an Allied facility during the occupation period, it eventually reverted to German control and was redeveloped as a civilian airport serving regional traffic. The underground portions remained sealed, though periodic inspections confirmed the structural stability of the filled chambers. In 1989, following German reunification, there was brief discussion of excavating and preserving part of the underground complex as a historical site. However, engineering assessments determined that the combination of fire damage, deliberate demolition during the original sealing operations, and decades of settling had made the structure too unstable for safe public access. The proposal was abandoned. Marcus Johnson passed away in 2003 at the age of 76. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press noted his contributions to the automotive industry and his community advocacy work. It mentioned his military service and his Bronze Star Medal, describing him as a decorated veteran of the conflict in Europe. The specific circumstances of that decoration, the cigarette and the underground airfield, were not detailed. His family gathered for the funeral to remember a man who had lived with quiet dignity and purposeful commitment to making his community better. Among his effects, they found extensive journals in which he had recorded his thoughts and experiences. The entries dealing with his military service were matter-of-fact and unsentimental, but one passage, written shortly after his return from Europe, captured something essential about his character. "I have been called a hero for what happened at that airfield," he wrote. "I accept the honor because refusing it would be disrespectful to those who bestowed it. But I know the truth. I was not heroic. I was careless. The outcome was beneficial only by chance. This does not diminish the importance of what was discovered, but it does illuminate something crucial about how life actually works. We are not in control. We cannot predict consequences. We can only act as thoughtfully as possible in each moment and hope that our small actions contribute to good rather than harm." That cigarette could have started a fire that harmed people. Instead, it revealed a secret that protected people. The difference was not in my intention, but in circumstances beyond my control. This is both humbling and liberating. We are responsible for our choices, but not for all their consequences. We must act with care, but also accept that the full meaning of our actions may remain forever mysterious. This understanding, forged in the accidental discovery of a hidden airfield, guided Marcus Johnson throughout his life. It informed his approach to engineering, where he advocated for multiple contingency planning and careful consideration of unintended consequences. It shaped his parenting, where he taught his children to think about the ripple effects of their choices. It influenced his community work, where he pushed for policies that acknowledged complexity rather than assuming simple cause and effect relationships. The story of the 18-year-old gunner and his accidentally consequential cigarette became, over decades, a minor legend within certain military and intelligence circles. It was cited in training programs about the importance of thorough site investigation. It appeared in academic studies of military deception and concealment. It was referenced in discussions of how victory in conflict requires more than winning battles. extending into the difficult work of genuinely securing and understanding captured territory. But the deeper significance of the incident lay not in its immediate military implications, but in what it revealed about the nature of consequence and meaning. Marcus Johnson's cigarette did not uncover the hidden airfield because he was particularly vigilant or skilled. It did so because of a chain of circumstances that included the specific location where he sat, the direction of his careless flick, the crack in the concrete grating, the design of the fuel distribution system, the volatility of the stored petroleum products, and countless other factors that aligned in one specific moment to produce one specific result. This alignment of circumstance and consequence happens continuously in all lives, though rarely with such dramatic visibility. Every choice, every action, every moment contains within it potential futures that branch outward in ways impossible to fully anticipate. We live in the intersection of intention and accident, skill and luck, planning and chance. The underground airfield in Bavaria, conceived as a secret weapon for a fantasy future, became instead a teaching tool about the limits of control and the reality of consequences. The elaborate deception, so carefully constructed, was undone not by superior intelligence work or military action, but by an 18-year-old soldier's casual disposal of a cigarette. All the planning, all the resources, all the effort invested in maintaining the secret proved vulnerable to pure accident. This vulnerability is simultaneously disturbing and hopeful. It is disturbing because it reveals how little we control. Even the most careful plans can be disrupted by the smallest unexpected event. But it is hopeful because it means that positive change, too, can emerge from unexpected sources. Solutions to problems need not come only from deliberate effort. Sometimes they arrive through accident, through the convergence of circumstances nobody planned. Marcus Johnson understood both aspects. He lived his life with intention and care, working to make positive contributions through conscious effort. But he also maintained humility about the limits of control, acknowledging that much of what mattered most in his life had come through circumstances beyond his planning. The medal on his wall was not just recognition for an accidental discovery. It was a reminder of this fundamental truth about human existence. The airfield, the cigarette, the hidden aircraft, the underground facility, the elaborate deception, all of these elements came together in one moment on a foggy May morning to produce consequences that rippled forward through decades. Intelligence procedures changed, security protocols were revised, engineering assessments became more thorough. And one young man from Detroit learned a lesson about consequence and humility that shaped the rest of his life. In the final analysis, the story of how an 18-year-old gunner exposed a hidden airfield with a carelessly discarded cigarette is not really about military intelligence or wartime deception. It is about the mysterious relationship between action and consequence, about how meaning emerges from the intersection of intention and accident, about the profound truth that we are all both more and less significant than we imagine ourselves to be. We are more significant because our smallest actions can have enormous consequences. We are less significant because those consequences often have nothing to do with our intentions or abilities. We live in this paradox, navigating between responsibility and humility, between agency and acceptance. Marcus Johnson's cigarette did not win a conflict or change the course of history in any fundamental way. The regime would have fallen regardless. The hidden aircraft would likely have been discovered eventually through other means, but in that specific moment, for the specific people involved, the consequences were real and immediate. A potential threat was neutralized, intelligence was gathered, security was improved. One young man received recognition that, however accidentally earned, marked him as someone who had made a difference. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps significance does not require grand gestures or heroic intentions. Perhaps it simply requires being present, acting according to our best understanding, and accepting that the full meaning of our actions will always exceed our comprehension. The fog burned away that May morning in 1945, revealing first the sun and then, through an improbable chain of consequences, a hidden airfield. The revelation changed immediate circumstances for the people involved, but more importantly, it illuminated a truth about human existence that transcends any specific historical moment. We are all in our own ways carelessly flicking cigarettes into the unknown. We are all waiting to see what secrets will be revealed, what consequences will emerge, what meaning will be discovered in actions we barely remember taking. This is not a cause for anxiety, but for thoughtful attention to the present moment. We cannot control consequences, but we can choose our actions. We cannot predict meaning, but we can act with integrity. We cannot see the future, but we can engage fully with the present. This was Marcus Johnson's ultimate lesson, learned accidentally on a foggy morning and refined through decades of reflection. It was a lesson about consequence and humility, about significance and acceptance, about the strange and wonderful mystery of being human in a world where the smallest moments can contain the largest meanings. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.